Hello and welcome along to a brand new episode of Aviation Analysis, the channel that investigates the most exciting, tragic and mysterious stories relating to aircraft and aerial adventures. In today's modern world, where conflict is commonplace, it can be confusing and equally terrifying to keep up with it all. Whether it be global warfare erupting in places such as the Middle East and Ukraine, or social unrest in the streets just outside your front door, it seems people are angry, greedy, and quite simply bloodthirsty for control, dominance and governance nowadays. Turn on your television or social media and it doesn't take very long to see yet another building being bombed or a mass grave of innocent civilians who were caught in the crossfires of war. It is such tragic imagery and understanding that we introduce today's episode. Touching on the war in Ukraine, one will be aware that the situation and relationship between Russia and its neighbour has been volatile for many years, to say the least, and dates back to before the invasion of 2022 by Vladimir Putin's army. On the 17th of July 2014, during the escalation in the Donbas region, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, a scheduled passenger flight between Amsterdam and Kuala Lumpur, was flying nearby when it was literally caught in the crossfire between the rival regions. The conclusive evidence pointed towards Russian-backed forces and to the BUK 9M38 surface-to-air missile that struck the doomed flight. So, what happened that day in 2014? Was it an accident? A simple case of wrong place, wrong time? Or was there something more sinister at play? Join us as we examine and track the ill-fated journey of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. It is worth taking note of the specifics of the flight schedule and plane itself before we dissect and discuss the terrible events that followed after it took off from Amsterdam. As mentioned, Flight 17, originally MH17, was a regularly scheduled 11.5-hour flight that would set off from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The plane itself was a Boeing wide-body 777-200, registration number 9M-MRD aircraft, which, on the day of the disaster, had a cabin crew of 15 and was carrying 283 passengers. These unfortunate souls were of mixed citizenship, a total of 10 nationalities that mainly consisted of 193 Netherlanders, many of which were due to attend the 20th International AIDS Conference, including scientist Joep Lang. 80 of the victims on board were children. On that morning, the plane took off from Amsterdam Airport Schiphol as scheduled at 10:31 UTC, Coordinated Universal Time. However, as it glided over the battlefields of Ukraine, something terrible occurred. Contact was lost after the plane was struck by a missile from below. No one would survive. To clarify the situation in Ukraine at the time, we must understand what militarized conflicts were occurring in the Donbas region between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian government, as the flight plan directed the aircraft across the entire breadth of Ukraine. The armed conflict began the same year as the doomed flights in the eastern region of Ukraine and has escalated and continued to this very day. During those early years, before the eventual build-up and order to implement President Putin's special militarized operation, the hostility and bloodshed had already claimed more than 14,000 people. Battles raged between the countries as the Ukrainian government fought Russian-backed separatists for control over the industrialized regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, also known as Donbas. Between September 2014 and February 2015, Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany signed several versions of what became known as the Minsk Agreements, a series of international agreements which sought to end the advancement of troops and ultimately end the war between both parties. After the defeat at Ilovaisk, where hundreds of soldiers died as the Ukrainian army and volunteers retreated on the 29th of August 2014, the Russian government forced Ukraine to sign the first Minsk Protocol. After discussions with Minsk, Belarus, the agreement was signed on the 5th of September 2014 by representatives of the Trilateral Contact Group and by the then leaders of the later named proxy statelets of the Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, and Luhansk People's Republic, LPR. This agreement was set to be implemented at the sounding of an immediate ceasefire. However, they were never enforced, and the battles raged on the ground, with a further 75,000 troops fighting along the 420-kilometer-long front line. Hopefully this gives us a little background and awareness of just how turbulent, barbaric, and unstable the situation was, both on the ground and in the air. Let us now look at the plane's journey and eventual demise. Flight 17 flew over this region at an altitude of about 33,000 feet, 10,000 meters, in accordance with minimum altitude restrictions, which, ironically, had been implemented by the Ukrainian aviation authorities just 3 days earlier. It is noted that, during the flight's entry over the Russian border, 3 other foreign passenger jets were also picked up and located in the same radar control sector. As per normal procedure, cabin crew members conducted their normal checks with the air traffic controllers, who, on this occasion, were stationed in Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro, Ukraine, and Rostov-na-Don, Russia, just before 13:20 hours UTC. This would be the last communications between those on the ground and those aboard Flight 17, as, after the checks were complete, all communication with the crew members was severed. 6 minutes later, the plane mysteriously and eerily vanished from the radar screens of air traffic control. Reports from those on the ground state that an explosion occurred mid-air during the time of the communication loss. When witnesses and authorities searched the nearby areas, pieces of the wreckage were spread across 20 square miles of the region. It is reported that the majority of the plane, its contents, and those on board were found within the farmlands and rural parts of the village of Hrabov, Ukraine, known to have been Russian separatists-held territory at the time. Despite the initial anger and suspicion when search and rescue teams arrived, the separatist officials actually provided them with the technological information they had, including the aircraft's data and voice recorders. There was no doubt that the plane had been struck by something and effectively blown out of the sky. So an investigative mission was arranged by the Dutch Ministry of Defence to ascertain what truly happened to Flight 17 and to bring those responsible to justice. The Dutch report itself was commissioned and separated into 3 consecutive investigations, all 3 countries' perspectives and examinations. Netherlands, Russia, and Ukraine authorities were all assigned responsibilities to locate and understand the role of the missiles and its mechanics. Researchers from all parties thoroughly examined evidence from the data recordings and scattered debris across the landscape of the ongoing war zones to try and determine the cause, with the Russians denying any culpability in the downing of the aircraft. Bad weather, pilot error, mechanical failure, or the possibility of an onboard fire or explosion were also ruled out by the investigative groups. It was concluded officially that Flight 17 had crashed due to the detonation of a warhead from a radar-guided missile, which had been deployed from a BUK, also known as SA-11, surface-to-air system. This particular missile had the potential to reach 33,000 feet and capability of destroying an airliner due to its specifications and design. Another damning piece of evidence that was later released was a video, which purported to show the rebels' forces sifting through the contents of the deceased passenger's luggage from the still smoking wreckage. The 17-minute clip was published a year after the events by News Corp Australia, but was a paramount piece of evidence at the time of the investigation. Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop described it as sickening to watch. In the video, pro-Russian separatists are seen to be rummaging around through the luggage from the downed aircraft in both amazement and bafflement as to how the plane had dropped from the sky. One man, who is seen to be dressed in camouflage gear, asks another man where the remains of a military Sukhoi bomber is. "There it is. It is the passenger plane," is the response. Seemingly without any care or respect for the dead passengers, the group strip their backpacks from them and scour the wreckage in search of anything valuable. One of the men opens a bag and says, "These are clothes." Another shouts, "A battery, some device and the charger from it." Finally, an ID card with KLIA is displayed to the camera, indicating that it is from flight crews at Kuala Lumpur Airport. A voice is heard uttering, "Fuck, passenger plane was fucked." A voice off-screen says later. Though many believe that the missile struck the plane directly, it was agreed by the Commission that the warhead actually exploded just a few feet away from the cockpit. This would have caused multiple shrapnel fragments to shoot through the fuselage of the aircraft, killing the cabin crew immediately on impact. From there, the front section of the plane would have disbanded and the wings, tail, and passenger sections would have coasted mid-air before falling from the sky to the ground below. In September 2016, the prosecutorial team presented evidence that the missile was indeed launched from separatist-held territory in Ukraine using weaponry acquired from Russia, equipment which was later returned the very same day. This suspicious action, combined with the data transfer logs, investigative intelligence and video evidence, was followed by an announcement by prosecutors that any suspects in the case would be brought to justice and tried in the Netherlands. Despite extradition difficulties, on June 19, 2019, Dutch prosecutors filed charges against 4 men, 3 Russians and a Ukrainian, in connection with the downing of the flight, 3 of which had ties to Russian intelligence agencies. In November 2022, Russians Igor Girkin and Sergei Dubinsky and Ukrainian national Leonid Karchenko were found guilty of 298 counts of murder and unlawfully causing an aeroplane to crash by the Hague District Court at Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. The 4th defendant, Oleg Pulatov, was acquitted after the court found that he had no prior knowledge of the shooting down of any aircraft. The sentencing of Igor Girkin was especially prominent in the case, as he was a former colonel with the Russian Federal Security Service, SFB, who commanded operations in Donetsk, but returned to Russia within a month of the downing of Flight 17. Russian opposition lawyer and politician Mark Fagin posted a purported order, which was given by Girkin, instructing his militants who have in their possession personal effects from this plane to deliver them to his headquarters, where they would be transferred to the defense fund of the DPR. Girkin responded with a bizarre and unrealistic interpretation of what transpired that day, stating that no living people were on board Flight 17. He claimed that the plane flew over the war zone on autopilot from Amsterdam and had been loaded with rotting corpses. The outlandish version described by the former colonel was aired on all state-controlled media outlets and was also part of various investigations and debates surrounding the tragedy. At a press conference on the 28th of July 2014, Girkin denied any connection to the Flight 17, claiming that he and his militant troops were killing black-skinned mercenaries. As with many tragic events, the families of the victims are normally left until the end when it comes to compensation or delivering closure on the horrors that their loved ones encountered. Though this is unjust and unfair at times, the case for damages and compensation for those affected was eventually settled in 2016 with Malaysia Airlines. Viru Miwa, a lawyer representing the Dutch victims of the crash, said that under the Montreal Convention of the International Civil Aviation Organization, the airline had to pay damages of up to €130,000 to victims' families, regardless of the debated circumstances of a crash. 10 years after that fateful day, a joint statement was delivered by Ambassador Christophe Kamp, permanent representative of the Netherlands to the OSCE, on July 18, 2024, to the Permanent Council in Vienna. Mr. Kamp stated that, "We remain steadfast in our commitment to achieving truth, justice and accountability for the victims of the downing of Flight MH17 and their next of kin. Those who have been left behind deserve closure." He went on to discuss his disappointment at the Russian Federation's withdrawal from proceedings that were to be in line with the ICAO dispute settlement rules. At the time of this video, death, destruction and political uncertainty continued to rage on in the battlefields across Ukraine as Russian forces continued to conduct their special military operation. Despite widespread condemnation of President Vladimir Putin's actions, the war goes on with more innocent people dying across the land and, unfortunately, shows no signs of ending. We watch in horror as more guns, rockets and missiles are fired across battle lines with no endgame in sight. The tragedy of Flight MH17 is one chapter in this never-ending saga, one that serves as a turning point in the early stages of the conflict. However, as with any war, Lessons from the past have not been learned. Better heads have not prevailed, and more people are dying every single day. Let us hope that the harrowing events from 10 years ago never happen again, for all of our sakes. Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Aviation Analysis. Take care, and we will catch you next time.